Ah, the new year, the time when one reflects on what's to come, both in love and career. But at Hero Journalism, we think about what superheroes the future might bring, and whether X-Men coming back to the MCU could happen as soon as 2020. Is that possible? That's the question we're looking at, and it's coming right up. Hello, heroes. Welcome to Hero Journalism. I'm 4Kate, and today we're taking a look at the future of the MCU, specifically Fantastic Four and the X-Men, and how soon could they possibly be in the MCU? Well, we've got a little bit of data to work from. We've got the MCU release schedule that's already been somewhat laid out. It could always change, of course. But most recently, we heard from Kevin Feige when he was interviewed by Variety magazine for their podcast, and he talked about when he expected to be able to officially work on the X-Men and Fantastic Four characters. Let's take a listen.
Let's talk briefly at the very end here. I wanted to touch on the Disney-Fox thing, which is, Disney's acquired Fox, so you've got this kind of sandbox of characters to play with, potentially now. I talked to the Russos about this in an earlier stage. We're in a later stage now. Have you been given the, yes, go, start thinking about these other characters yet?
No, not yet, but we've been told it's looking very good and could happen in the first 6 months of next year.
Could that be a skeleton key to unlocking an entire new direction for this kind of overarching cinematic universe?
The notion of the characters that had previously been under a Fox agreement coming back is great. Number one, it's nice when a company that created all these characters can have access to all those characters. It's unusual not to. Marvel has been in a unique position to not have access to the characters in a long time. And for me, going full circle to our conversation, that's where I started. That's where I started, almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
So it's exciting. But in terms of actually thinking about it and actually planning things, we haven't started that yet.
So Feige is saying that he expects to be able to start working on these characters by June 2019. So that to me says that this would be possibly in play as early as the end of Q1 of 2019. So if you think somewhere around March or April, it could be as early as that. June certainly sounds like a hard date that we could certainly work from, but technically we could get a few extra months on that in the schedule to see how quickly they could turn around X-Men or Fantastic Four production. Now, the main thing the main additional piece of data, other than what Feige and Marvel Studios has released, is what they've released previously, their release schedule. So as we know now, there are 3 films a year that they're doing. So we know what their 3 films are in 2019. That leaves 3 films in 2020 that we do not know. And that leaves 3 films in 2021 that we don't know. And when I was looking at the release date schedule, looking around online to see what the latest news was on that, Den of the Geek actually listed 4 release dates for 2020, and curiously, 2 of those were Sony release dates. Now, neither of those would have been a Sony Spider-Man film, or actual Spider-Man proper film, because that's coming out next in 2019, so the next sequel with Tom Holland starring Tom Holland would be 2021. So they're speculating that those could be either Morbius the Living Vampire, rumored to be with Jared Leto, or the sequel to Venom, which is certainly a possibility. However, I wonder why those would be lumped in with Marvel's schedule, because until we hear otherwise, those are still Sony productions. We know that they're going to continue their agreement with the Spider-Man proper films, but we don't know yet whether that extends to any Spider-Man spin-off films. So, for example, would Venom 2, unlike Venom 1, suddenly be a Marvel production when that comes into production? It's certainly possible, but it's strange to me to lump those in as Marvel productions until there's been a formal announcement. I mean, we know that Marvel's going to do 3 shows a year, 3 movies a year, and if one of those is the Sony Spider-Man, typically that's going to leave them 2 slots for their in-house characters, the characters that they control in-house. If they had 2 Sony films in a single year, if that does become announced that that Marvel will also be taking over production and responsibilities of the Spider-Man spin-off movies, I find that strange that Marvel would let 2 of their annual slots go towards Sony films. If I would think that they would want to add another slot so that they can still have their 3. It just seems strange to me, but who knows? Anything's possible. And of course, if there's been an agreement for these spin-off films to go back to MCU along with the Spider-Man proper franchise, then, you know, maybe that makes this all moot. Maybe they would consider that a Marvel Cinematic Universe film. It would be, I guess. So that's some of the thoughts I had when I was looking at it. But still, when I look at those next 2 years, not 2019, but 2020 and 2021, I think it's a fair bet that other than the 3rd Tom Holland Spider-Man movie, those should be MCU proper properties. We don't know for sure, but that's just the assumption I think we have to work with until we know more officially about the Sony spin-offs. Anyways, so where does that leave us? Well, for starters, obviously a lot of films have been rumored, not nearly as much as at Sony or Warner Brothers, who don't really seem to have their act together. But one interesting thing that this shows is that obviously we've all noticed that Marvel's taken a change of approach slightly. In fact, there's been some rumors or comments leaked lately that indicate that Marvel is going to switch away from big crossover movies and go kind of back to more self-contained features like the first handful that started the MCU in the beginning, Iron Man, Captain America, etc. And that makes sense because a big part of the cost of Infinity War was the cost of assembling all of these super expensive stars. So I think that seems like a very logical choice to try and keep budgets down. And also for a change of pace. They want to explore new areas of the Marvel Universe and shine a light on new characters. That makes sense. But we have this lingering residue from the previous Marvel universes, specifically the sequels. So you have to imagine that Black Panther 2, Doctor Strange 2 are going to be, and Guardians 3 would be huge possibilities for all those. Guardians 3 on hold at the time, so we'll put that off to the side. But certainly Black Panther 2 has to be an absolute no-brainer with the money that made. It was, I'm sure that is one of their higher priorities as far as getting to the sequels. I would say higher a priority than Doctor Strange 2, though I think that's very likely that could be one of them as well. So those are the sequels, and we've also heard rumors about new films coming out. So specifically, one of the new films that allegedly is coming out is, or one of the rumors that we've heard rumors of a Black Widow solo movie with Scarlett Johansson. That certainly could be a possibility, especially with her star power. They may want to still try and get some mileage out of her potential with the character. And then also, one of the more interesting directions that we've heard is the Eternals. So I think that there's a good chance that Eternals is coming soon. I tell you, again, I would have been shocked to hear that even, weeks and months ago. But I think it's likely. So where does that leave us? Let's dig down and crunch the numbers. Is X-Men or Fantastic Four possible? Even maybe as early as next year? Well, if we look at those slots, again, if we're assuming 3 slots for 2020, 3 slots for 2021, and those are for Marvel characters, or at least 5 of those would be for Marvel characters, Marvel not including Sony's characters, then one would assume that there would be at least one slot open in 2020 and possibly 1 or 2 in 2021. Even if you're going to throw in a Black Panther 2 sequel or a Doctor Strange 2 sequel, if both, maybe it tightens it up a little bit, but there's certainly still one or two release dates in those areas that are open right now. Now, if you look at their 2020 release schedule, they had a release date for November 6th, I think, of 2020, and I think they may have just bumped that up to August. Now, if it's November, if it bumps it up to August, that's a little bit tighter. But if you start to do the math backwards, Feige said he will have Fantastic Four and X-Men by June. So if we assume, again, as I mentioned earlier, that it could happen as late as June or as early as April, that would be the second quarter of 2019, then they could still technically squeeze in a film for the end of 2020. It sounds a little crazy to think that we could have a Fantastic Four or X-Men film as quickly as next year, but technically I think it could be possible. Depends a little bit on what they've got for a script. Now, of course, you may have heard that Marvel has been barred from actively developing these properties until the sale is final. However, there's nothing that we know for sure about whether Marvel had previously developed those properties. If that's the case, I'm not even sure if they're technically allowed to develop a script, but if they don't have the final rights. But since it's Marvel, or it's a spec, 'cause people do produce spec scripts all the time. They send them in and they're just rejected to the studio. So anyways, if that's possible, then one might think that they could have a Fantastic Four or an X-Men script in somewhat decent shape, so that, say, around April or March, or April or May, they get the word from the lawyers that the Fox to Disney buyout is through. They take that script, which is maybe 50 to 70% there. They work on it 3 months. They get it to where they need. If it's close enough, 3 months could do it. Then they take 6 months of production time. That's going to take you close to the end of 2019. Now, if your release date is November or December of 2020, that still gives you about 9 to 10 months, maybe even a little bit more, for your post-production and special effects, CGI, etc. Marvel, if you look at how they've been handling their production output in the last 2 years or so, they've actually, several of their movies have only had about a year of post-production time. Some movies will take as much as 2 years, depending on how in-depth the CGI is. So Infinity War started production from January and then ended in July of 2017. Now, and they weren't even done yet. They still had some reshoots to do a little bit later in the year. But the movie came out in April 2018. That's several months less than a full year of post-production from the end of principal photography to the release date. Now, of course, post-production is happening while principal photography is going on, so there's overlap there. So technically they may have had still a full year. But for most films, they're going to have at least a year from the ending of principal photography. So if you look at Avengers, were pretty comfortable doing a post-production schedule of around like 9 or 10 months. And that's on a huge film, really huge film. So if you're thinking, if they had a script that they could get together within 3 months, if they could do their pre-production within 6 months, we could actually see an X-Men movie or a Fantastic Four movie by 2020. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, but it's certainly possible. And in reviewing the numbers and the scheduling, I thought that was pretty interesting and wanted to point that out. But let's step back from that and say, okay, we all agree that can't happen. Or maybe they come out and they say it's not going to happen. Another rumor that's been floating around the internet is, will there be an X-Men post-credits sequence in Avengers Endgame? That's certainly possible, one would assume. Well, actually, probably not. As I said, if you look at, Feige said that he expects by June 2019 to be able to work on X-Men or Fantastic Four. If you go back to what I said, is that he thinks it'll happen sometime in the second quarter of 2019, happens a little bit before June, then that's totally within the realm of possibility that you could turn around a film, especially if they can maintain to the schedule of doing their post-production and special effects within 9-10 months from the commencement of or the end of principal photography. That technically could happen. Okay, so let's put that aside. Let's just assume that we all agree that that can't happen. They couldn't turn around an X-Men or a Fantastic Four film, or let's say that maybe the Fox Disney deal doesn't even go through by June. Maybe he was being optimistic. Kevin Feige, that is. Certainly a possibility. Another rumor that's been going around the internet is whether there might be an X-Men cameo in the post-credit sequence for Avengers Endgame. Now that certainly seems possible, just be a post-credits sequence. However, if we look back to what I was saying, that Feige says he expects it by June, but if that means sometimes during the second quarter of 2019, if it was like by, April or something, that would give them a couple months, a month or so, and that would certainly be within their limitations as far as being able to whip together a quick post-credit sequence. That would be possible. However, it would require a few things to line up right. They would have to, the Disney-Fox deal would have to come through a little bit early. They'd have to be ready for it. They'd have to have their casting, if they're going to show any of the characters that they want to have down the road. That's going to be a little bit of a casting session and negotiation to see who's available, who you can get. So it's probably a little bit unlikely. Of course, there could be maybe a post-credit sequence that's a little bit more vague, just shows the X-Mansion and maybe not, an actual character like Wolverine or something. Of course, if they decided to cast Hugh Jackman, that would make, that part of it just instant, and, they actually could do a post-credit sequence. I don't know that we should expect that, but however, okay, so let's assume that's off the table as well. That would be too heavy a lift, too little time to pull it off. So where does that leave us? Well, it certainly leaves us in the, I think, reasonable expectation that by 2020, we should have, or at least maybe even by the end of 2019, we should have a cameo of the X-Men if they decide to introduce them in that fashion. They may not want to do, hint to them or whatever as a cameo. They've done it a lot of times before with the post-credit sequences. But if they did it on a cameo, we could get that by the end of this year, actually, because that could be the August-November release date, would even have a little bit more time to work with on the cameo. And then also 2020, we would think it would be definitely by 2020. And as far as the full feature-length film, I think we're looking at 2021. I still think there's a small possibility that it could happen in 2020, but at this point, it would. I think that, especially since the Marvel has said that they're moving into a new phase, they want to start to try and explore new characters. It sounds like Iron Man, Thor, Captain America are going to be retired, at least indefinitely, maybe brought back later, who knows. But if that's the case, and they're starting to go to Eternals and Black Widow and such, all great characters, no doubt. I'm not complaining or trying to dismiss them in any way, but suddenly your prime characters that are back in your fold, it's like, oh my gosh, now they have a chance to go for upper echelon, top tier Marvel characters again. But they're all new, or at least new to the MCU, if not new to the public. And I think that would be something that they would be focused on. So I think by 2021, we've got at least one of those two films, Fantastic Four or X-Men. And I think there's a good chance we might see at least a hint of them before that. So who knows? I'm just speculating, but it's speculation based off of what the data is that's been released so far. Anyways, let me know what you think. You think there's a possibility? Do you care? Obviously you do. We all want this to happen, right? Let me know in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. Check out some of our other videos, and we'll see you here next time on Hero Journalism.